Peter Dutton presses the button on his nuclear gamble. We now know where the coalition wants to build reactors. We don't know the cost, the impact on power prices, or whether the opposition still wants the renewables rollout to proceed. Plenty to ask our guest today, the author of this policy, Ted O'Brien. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. It's only a partial policy at this stage, but already creates a stark election choice for voters. Peter Dutton has named the 7 sites where the coalition wants to build government-owned nuclear reactors. The price tag, he says, will be revealed very soon. But there's an immediate concern. Industry groups and experts fear this plan will spook private investment in the renewables and storage needed right now as ageing coal plants shut down. If investment in new energy supply dries up, power prices will only rise. But the opposition has now set its course and it's willing to override the states, the companies that own the sites and any local community concerns to deliver this nuclear future.
Nuclear reactors across the country. That's the federal opposition's plan outlined by leader Peter Dutton today.
It's time for an adult conversation about keeping the lights on and pushing power prices down.
We have to have nuclear energy in the mix.
As coal retires from the system, it will be replaced with zero emissions nuclear energy.
The future supplying of electric power to entire cities.
7 nuclear plants to be built across the country under a future coalition government. Reactor models currently in use overseas, placed at the sites of existing or recently retired coal plants.
Having 2 plants up and running by 2037 is ambitious in the same way me wanting to compete in pole vault at the Brisbane Olympics is ambition. Sure, it's possible, but you wouldn't want to bet on it.
The assets will be owned by the Commonwealth, a very important point.
It might be the dumbest policy ever put forward by a major political party.
The Australian people now have a very clear choice.
I'm very happy for the election to be a referendum on energy, on nuclear.
The reaction to Peter Dutton's reactors was immediate.
We've seen no costs, we've seen no gigawatts, we've seen no detail. This is a joke. It's a serious joke because it threatens our transition.
We'll work with the state premiers. Some debate about that, I see.
We've got a prohibition on nuclear power in the state. My government's not going to waive it.
Nuclear energy is toxic, it's risky.
It will make power more expensive. So why on earth would we pursue it?
We'll deal with the cost in the next stage of our policy announcements.
Am I missing something? Are we in a new twilight zone?
It's not going to happen. If I wanted to tune into a fantasy, I'd watch Lord of the Rings.
If the Labor Party tried this from opposition, we would have been torn apart.
When will we see those costings?
Very soon, Carlos, very soon.
Days, weeks?
I think very soon.
It's the cost, stupid, and the cost of nuclear is way over the top.
Why is he doing this? You'll have to ask Mr. Dutton. I didn't come up with this fantasy, he did. You'll have to ask him. All right, thank you.
My guest this morning is the Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Ted O'Brien. First, let's check what's making news. With just days left before the end of the financial year, the Coalition has agreed to pass Labor's Small Business Instant Asset Write-Off. As Claire Armstrong reports in News Corp papers, it ends a months-long standoff, giving tradies and other small firms certainty. The Coalition had wanted a higher threshold, but has now agreed to back Labor's figure, allowing assets worth up to $20,000 to be instantly written off. In the 9 newspapers, Peter Dutton's claim the annual waste generated by a small modular nuclear reactor amounts to the size of a Coke can is hard to swallow, according to experts. One professor from Griffith University is quoted saying an SMR would generate many tonnes of waste per year, and it would likely be more radioactive than waste from a large-scale reactor. Meanwhile, new analysis on the Coalition's plan suggests 7 reactors would provide less than 5% of Australia's energy needs by 2050. The Smart Energy Council says the reactors would deliver a total of only 11 gigawatts of capacity, about 3.7% of what Australia will need. The Grattan Institute estimates they'd generate only 10 gigawatts. The Coalition is yet to reveal its own numbers. Now, Peter Dutton's nuclear pitch is pretty simple. Plenty of other countries have gone down this path. Sure, it might cost a lot, but delivers reliable, emissions-free power for decades. But there's nothing simple when it comes to the shifting energy market. Cheap renewables are changing the game and making nuclear less competitive, even in countries like France. And the coalition is sending mixed signals on whether it still wants the renewables rollout to continue in the meantime, something private investors are very keen to be urgently cleared up. Let's see what the panel makes of it. And we're joined this week by David Crowe, Ashleigh and Melissa Clarke. Welcome to the couch.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. Let's start with this big gamble of Peter Dutton. David, will it work?
I think you'd have to say at the moment it probably won't work. I think it's been a pretty poor start to the debate in terms of the coalition only naming the 7 locations, talking about state ownership of the nuclear power plants, but not being able to say anything about the cost, not telling us what kind of nuclear power plants they've got in mind. I mean, some of them would be big, some of them would be small modular reactors, but who would build them? What kind of reactors would they be? Would they be the Korean types or the Westinghouse, units from the United States?
The big thing's the price, though, isn't it? What's the power price going to be for us all?
They can't, because they can't tell us the cost of the nuclear power plants. They can't give us any assurance about what that would do to household bills, and that's the bottom line, isn't it? Now, I think having said that, I think that there is an argument to be had, a debate to be had about this, because we're not building enough energy generation right now. We're not building enough renewables. The regulators have pointed this out, so we need something to be done with the grid.
Yeah.
Now, there may be a case for nuclear. It's just that there are examples in the United States and in the UK with horrific cost blowouts and delays to projects.
I think every plant that's been built this century in comparable countries like the US, UK
and so we need answers on that.
They're taking a long time, they're costing a hell of a lot. Yeah. Look, but there's obviously some fertile ground the coalition believes opens the way for having this argument. Are people, Ash, particularly in some parts of Australia, really frustrated with how the renewables rollout is going?
Yes, and this is what this taps into. There's almost 2 parts to this. There's the policy and the realist, how realistic this policy is, and it's not a serious alternate policy yet. We have been promised that there'll be more details to come. We might get a few more from Dan O'Brien.
Right. Yeah.
So that's on you, Spearsy.
Thanks.
But there's also this. The main part is this debate, and it's perhaps a nuclear debate we should have had as a country 50 or 20 years ago. There's this view that it's too late to go. We've chosen another path, that it's perhaps too late to have this nuclear debate now. But
because we've seen such a development of cheap renewables.
Yes, and we chose coal-fired power. Now we're switching to renewables, and so because we're starting from a standing start, that we're 10, 15, 20 years away from it. We don't have the expertise, we don't have the workforce here really in Australia. So there's that part. But just back to your original question in terms of the energy costs, and this is where there's this debate around nuclear, and it started around energy prices. And Peter Dutton is clearly trying to tap into the pain that people are feeling currently, and there is frustration with the renewable rollouts. There's a lack of understanding for the average person who's just looking at that bill. And I think that there is a risk here that what we haven't seen green groups or companies really come out. They're treating it like this crazy idea, and even Labor to some extent calling it a fantasy without being ready with the modelling or the cost to combat it. And I think there is a risk, and this is a test for Labor, whether this debate does get away on them because it's not being treated seriously.
And I think part of the problem here is that there is a very serious debate that we need to have about what we're doing in the next 10 years, because there is an issue with getting enough energy into the grid when coal exits the system. But what that is the bit we need to debate. And, we're hearing an argument from the coalition it should be nuclear. And that might be something they can talk about provides cheaper power down the track, maybe it's something we could have come to. But it won't solve the problem in the next 10 years, which is when the crisis is.
And these coal plants are shutting down between now and in the next decade. 90% will be gone.
90% of them will be gone. Nuclear power plants will not be here in that time frame. So something will need to be in that time frame.
Without getting too technical, Mel, the other thing too is, do we want power generators that run 24/7, or does the best fit with nuclear something that you can turn on and off?
Yeah, so nuclear, yes, it can replace coal as a base load, but the way the energy grid has already changed is to have variable renewable in it, which is already happening at a large amount. And what we already see is the need for energy sources that can be turned on and off to adjust for that. That's why we need batteries, that's why we need pumped hydro, and we can provide what was a base load power through variable renewable if it's firmed. But we're getting to the point where we have so much variable energy, particularly from rooftop solar. We know how popular that is from households. So many households are using rooftop solar during the day now that the demand for electricity from the grid is dipping down to what they call the minimum operating levels. There's a point where we don't even need the coal at times of day currently. So if we're going to have a fixed source of energy coming at that point, it's going to have to be diverted somewhere.
Some days you do, though, and the last week's a good example of, a week when you do need it.
But you can't turn, but the nuclear power plant, you can't turn it on and off. It's too expensive. So realistically, if you're looking at it, it will run at a loss, and it's perhaps why the government has to own it, because a private company is not going to want to run something because it will run at a loss a lot of the time.
Which is why there's the debate about renewables, because they would undercut nuclear at those peak periods. But I think the nuclear debate does actually highlight the gas debate as well, because if you need some baseload power to come in, or some additional energy to firm up renewables, if it's not nuclear, there is a place for gas. And this is a difficult subject because a lot of people want gas to be phased out. But there could be a role for gas-fired power over the long term.
What about the local communities? Let's look at what we do know. We know where these 7 sites now are that the Coalition want reactors to go. They're pretty confident the communities will come on board. They've done a bit of focus group research there. They haven't given us the numbers, but they say that it's okay. But there is this question about, well, what if a local community says no? There's meant to be this consultation period. What's it worth? The Nationals' deputy leader, Perrin Davey, seemed to suggest that locals could still say no.
We're only looking at these 7 sites, and so if a community is absolutely adamant, well, then we will not proceed, but we will not be looking beyond these 7 sites.
Her leader then, some hours later, David Littleproud, said she was wrong. Does that suggest they would ignore local objections if there are local objections?
That was the unambiguous position from David Littleproud. It was, these sites are the sites, they will go ahead. I don't know what that means for consultation then. It does seem to be a little bit of a fig leaf.
Yeah, and it seems there hasn't been a lot of consultation in the lead up to it. But look, we have seen governments steamroll communities before and say this is happening, but we've also seen communities mobilise. You see around coal seam gas, and they really mobilise if they are opposed to it. But I think there's also a bigger issue too in terms of the companies that own these sites. Like AGL, the Liddell Power Station, which is one of them, they've already turned to sod. They're building a battery. So they're not just going to hand over this site to the government. So what happens there?
Just puts up the cost.
Well, this goes to
within the coalition. There are lots of different ideas here, and you can see from those clips just then how it's not settled. I mean, some of the ideas in the coalition are, if a region gets a nuclear power plant, they get lower electricity bills for those households in that area. Now, these are ideas being discussed.
We'll try and clear that up with Ted O'Brien in a minute.
Interesting concept.
Before we
that would then shift the debate on whether that community
if you're going to get free power, maybe that's going to shift opinion. They would be government owned. We mentioned earlier maybe there's no private sector interest given the risks that are involved here. These would be government owned. The government would carry the cost and the financial risk as well.
The assets will be owned by the Commonwealth, a very important point, and we'll work with experts to deliver these programs. We'll work with the state premiers. Some debate about that I see. As you know, I think somebody famously said I wouldn't stand between a premier and a bucket of money.
Paul Keating said that. So buckets of money for the states as well, or would they just override the states, use their constitutional power to?
They'd have to override them, surely. I mean, there's going to be objections on all manner of levels.
This is a party that argues for states' rights, though.
Yeah, exactly. The Liberal Party stands up for the federation in theory, but here they would have to, bulldoze their way through. I've seen one example of a nuclear power facility that's been only 4 years late, which is like a miracle. And delivered, a $20 billion cost with many billions more to come. That's in the United Arab Emirates. It's near Abu Dhabi, built by KEPCO, the Korean company. That was 15 years from planning to completion. It went on stream this year. But that's a small country, not an open democracy like ours, no federation, no local government.
Used a lot of cheap labour.
Yeah. Exactly. And so you can't see a scenario like that being applied in Australia with so many barriers and obstacles.
One other issue.
And even setting up a regulatory body, like that takes so long to set up on something from nuclear. Like there's just so many parts to this.
One other issue is the waste. Mentioned earlier, this line that Peter Dutton has used all week about it's only a Coke can worth of waste when you talk about one of these small modular reactors. They've distributed an image from Rolls-Royce of a small modular reactor. This is it. It's a design concept. But have a look at what Rolls-Royce says itself about waste from one of these 470 megawatt small modular reactors they're planning. Over its 60-year lifetime, an SMR generates around 285 cubic metres of spent nuclear fuel, about the size of a tennis court. That's a bit more than a Coke can.
It certainly is, and I think the Coalition have been given something of an answer on this question by saying that we can store nuclear waste at the site of facilities for the lifetime of the facilities. Now, what's been talked about is a facility that is 80 years. So effectively, the policy is the waste will stay in the communities that host the nuclear power plants.
Well, locals then would need to know that as well, right?
That actually happens at Lucas Heights now because they can't decide where to store nuclear waste in Australia.
And they send it
it's a long-running problem, and the federal governments haven't grappled with this over years, where to put nuclear waste.
Even Ziggy Switkowski, who's perhaps the most well-known and vocal proponent of nuclear energy in Australia, says that it's incredibly disappointing that Australia hasn't been able to get to the point where it can land even on a process to get to a site, let alone find a site.
And a site, it's fair to point out, a site will have to be found for the waste from the nuclear submarines under the government's AUKUS plans as well. Anyway, time to talk to the Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Ted O'Brien, the author of this policy. Now, he says nuclear will deliver cheaper power, despite experts saying it is one of the most expensive forms of electricity. Either way, it would be at least 11 years before the first reactor comes online, under the Coalition's best case scenario. All 7 would take well into the 2040s to deliver. So what does happen in the meantime? Will the market stop investing in renewables and batteries, the stuff the industry says we need right now as coal plants shut down? That's the fear of the Australian Industry Group, which represents manufacturers. It's worried power prices will only rise if investors hit the brakes. Ted O'Brien, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, David.
So just clear this up for us. Coal plants we know are closing. If there is no replacement for them, will prices go up?
No, you see, our approach is a balanced energy mix, and Labor's approach is all eggs in one basket, renewables only. We all know what happened to Labor's promise of a $275 reduction in household power bills. Australians now are paying among the highest electricity prices in the world. Under our plan, we have learnt from other markets around the world, and therein is the importance of a balanced mix, which means today we have renewables, we have gas, and we have coal. As we move towards the future, we see 90% of our baseload power exiting the grid within 10 years. In the future, we will still have renewables, we will have gas, and we will have zero emissions nuclear energy.
I'll come to that.
As part of the net zero grid.
In the next 10 years, as these coal plants shut down, as you agree, won't prices go up if that investment isn't there to replace them right now?
You're right in that if you have limited supply, then prices go up. Price is always a function of supply and demand.
So do you want investment to continue in these renewables?
And so we do need to bring in more supply. Critically, we have been criticising the government on strangling the supply of gas. we need to pour more gas into the market. Then when it comes to renewables, we support the continuation of rolling out renewables, but we're different from the government. The government believes the aim of the game is to maximise the amount of renewables on the grid. They want the maximum amount. We want the optimum amount, optimum as part of a balanced mix.
What's the difference?
Well, the difference is right now you've got Anthony Albanese and Chris Bowen still wanting 82% renewables on the grid by 2030.
What do you want?
Nobody believes them. Nobody believes it's even possible, right? And so here's the problem. Investment has already stalled. And so much as Labor's out there now saying, oh, if the coalition introduces zero emissions nuclear energy,
investment with respect hasn't stalled. It's absolutely continuing. If 82% is too much,
David, to be honest, it has. If I can make this point, it's actually
who's told you that it has?
If you look at any of the research, look at what even the Clean Energy Council says. Look what experts like Tony Wood say. Labor's rollout is running about 1/3 of the pace that it said it would.
It hasn't stalled though. It's about 4 gigawatts a year. It needs to be higher, but it's not stalled.
Final investment decisions on renewables have fallen since the coalition entered office. That is a fact. Are renewables still coming on the grid? Yes, and we welcome that. But it's already stalled, and that's why they've introduced a capacity investment scheme.
Explore this. You welcome more renewables, but David Littleproud, the Nationals leader, has said you want to cap the large-scale renewable rollout. Can you give us any? Is he right? Do you want to put a cap there? What's your explanation of the market?
In fairness to David Littleproud, I too read those same reports, and David addressed this at our joint press conference on Wednesday and made it very clear that as a coalition we are united around that vision of a 2050 net zero electricity grid. And we understand the importance of a balanced mix to get there, and that includes renewables.
Do you want to cap investment in renewables?
No, there's no discussion about capping investment.
Well, he said we want to send the investment signals that there is a cap on where we go with renewables.
And he has subsequently himself addressed that.
So that's
on
not
Wednesday.
Right?
On Wednesday, he explained that is not the coalition position. We will continue to look.
So your message to the market
renewables
right now, to companies like AGL and Alinta and so on, is to keep investing.
We need investment continuing on renewables, on gas, and as you see...
No cap.
As you see zero emissions nuclear energy coming into the market, you will see a balanced mix. And we'll, again, in due course, we'll be talking more about the balanced mix as we will about the economics.
So not 82%, but you will have a figure of, what, 60% renewables? Or...
We're not releasing anything today,
No,
David,
I understand, but that will come.
But 82% by 2030, Labor to this day says it's going to do it. I cannot find a serious analyst in this country who suggests that is even possible.
What about
Meanwhile,
by 20...
prices are going through the roof.
2050 net zero is a bipartisan position.
It is.
But how much will nuclear make up of the mix under your approach? We showed earlier what other groups reckon it'll be, less than 5%. What will 7 reactors deliver?
So to clarify, we're talking about 7 plants.
So it could be more than 7 reactors.
7 plants, right? And one of the lessons we've learned from overseas is in order to get costs down, you need multi-unit sites.
So a plant could have more than 1 reactor?
Correct. So let's say the small modular reactors, for example, and there are different ones, but if you say a 300 megawatt reactor, right? When you talk about a nuclear plant, these are modularised compartments. You can build 300, add another 300, add another 300, right? So you're talking about multi-unit plants.
So you could have, what, half a dozen reactors on one plant?
Well, we would, in terms of exactly how many on any plant, we would be leaving that to the Independent Nuclear Energy Coordinating Authority, but it is right that we would be wanting multi-unit sites. That's how you got to get costs down. Again, what we are doing is based on best practice internationally.
And what the market needs to know is then how much of the mix will be nuclear? Will it be 10%?
And so again, our energy mix we'll talk about in the future ahead of the next election. This is what the market
needs to know now. I mean, if it's only going to be a tiny fraction of the market...
They won't have long to wait, David, until they understand the energy mix.
Look, they need to know very soon, right now, really, whether they should keep investing or not. And what matters is whether nuclear is going to make up 20, 50% of the energy mix or 2 or 3% of the energy mix.
So a couple of things. Firstly, I'm a Liberal and I appreciate and respect that investors want to make money. But to be really clear, our focus is on the Australian people who want to save money. And so we have designed this policy with a crystal clear vision of Australians paying for cheaper, cleaner, and
they'll only
consistent
do that.
24/7
They'll
power.
only do that if the market keeps investing, as you've
Indeed,
acknowledged
and
at the
I think
outset.
I've answered that, acknowledging the need. But
they'll only invest if you give them some clarity on whether nuclear is going to take up 50% or 2% of the mix.
They will get clarity. And
do you know this answer?
In terms of the broader energy mix, David, we will be coming out with that in due course.
But do you know yourself, or will you leave this to another body to work that out? You mentioned earlier this body that will work out how many reactors will go on each plant site. That suggests you haven't worked this out.
So we have done our planning and we'll be very explicit about our assumptions.
Do you know?
But about our assumptions.
Do you know the answer to this question?
Rephrase the question. Is it
the question
specific
is,
gigawatts?
how much of the energy mix will be nuclear under your plan?
We will be announcing that at the time that we announce our broader mix. Because, David...
But do you know it at the moment? Do you know it at the moment? Or would this be for an independent body to work out?
We've announced the nuclear part of our policy. We are yet to announce the renewables part. We're yet to announce the gas part and any market reforms that come with it. And this is why it's so important you look at the balanced mix, because you and I, when we go home, we see our energy bill. What's in that bill is a reflection of the entire system, the balanced mix. And therefore, when people talk about costs, and they have, and I don't blame them, I don't blame them at all, but the real question is not on nuclear, for example, how much it costs, but is it value for money?
I think a lot of people worry about how much it costs and whether it's going to be pushing their bills up.
But it's from a
coming back to this question, because I just want to be clear on this.
Go ahead.
You're not sure at the moment whether nuclear would make up only 5% of the energy mix?
David, we've done all the work on the nuclear front, but
do you know this?
But until we release renewables policy and gas policy, I'm not going to be talking about the portion of the mix.
Will that come from you before the election?
We'll be very clear as to what we believe the potential capacity could be through to 2050.
Okay, so that will come before the election. That won't be for an independent body to work out.
The independent body is to work out at each site what is the feasibility of certain technologies, and only from there can you come down to a specific number of gigawatts. So that is the same with...
So the number of gigawatts would be left to an independent body to work out how many gigawatts?
The independent bodies would look at each plant and come up with a recommendation as to what sort of technology should be used, and from there it would be exactly what capacity based on that technology.
So you won't know before the election how much nuclear energy we're going to get?
We'll be crystal clear on what we have planned for 2050. That's what I just said.
But you just said the independent body will work out how many gigawatts.
Well, there's two things happening here, David. Two things happening right now, right? You're talking about us formulating policy, and we'll be very clear about how we've done it. And I'm happy to talk about how we've done it today. I'm just not announcing.
No, I'm just after this. The market.
Hear me out.
You talk to anyone in the market right now. They will say, we need to know how much is nuclear going to make up of the pie.
And therefore, we'll be clear about our planning process to say, this is how much capacity we believe the Australian market will have of nuclear come 2050.
Okay.
But then when your question goes to, so the very specific gigawatts or megawatts, well, again, we're going to have an independent nuclear energy coordinating authority that will look at each plant.
That is the capacity, though, isn't it?
But it's the same right now. If you look at wind, if you look at solar, if you look at gas, if you look at coal, has Anthony Albanese or Chris Bowen been able to tell you precisely the megawatts in any future year? I ask you that. Have they? They never have.
The integrated system plan from the Australian Energy
Market
Operator does give you that.
Have they been accurate?
Well, they update it every year, and
but have you looked back to see if they're accurate, David?
I haven't personally looked back to see how accurate that is, but it's there. It's in black and white every year.
This is the problem. The integrated system plan by the market operator, I feel desperately sorry for them, because they have to accept the Albanese government's targets, and then they've got to work it out. Instead, our approach is to put the Australian consumer, the household, the business, at the centre of everything, from system planning all the way through to system design. That creates a very different marketplace, but it gets prices down.
Will you still need the renewables rollout to continue to cover 95% of the energy mix?
No. We will still need renewables in the mix. Labor is assuming up to 98%, again, if you believe the ISP. So a 98% renewables energy grid.
What will yours be?
So again, and you're very good at this, but I'm not going to be announcing.
Okay.
I'm not going to be announcing the next. But I will make this point, David. We believe that Australia needs always on 24/7 baseload power in the system. If you get 98% of the grid, which is all variable and weather dependent, as we move forward and we have to tackle the challenge of climate change, we all know that weather is going to become more volatile. So the last thing we should do is have our entire electricity system weather dependent. You need baseload power.
There's still gas as part of their plan, batteries and pumped hydro for.
Well, they say gas is part of their plans, but we have not seen one initiative. There's not one funding program in the budget. The lights are going to go out under Labor. Prices are going to soar.
Where does the figure of more than $1 trillion for the renewables rollout come from?
So that comes from the Princeton University, University of Queensland and University of Melbourne study. They modelled different scenarios. One of those scenarios is similar. It is not the precise scenario of Labor's. In fact, I think it's conservative compared to Labor's, and that's where that number comes from.
And that includes, just to be clear for everybody, not just the government, but industry, households, you putting solar on your roof, buying an electric car, it's everything, isn't it?
That is the total cost, whether you or I pay for that as consumers, David, or as taxpayers.
Yeah, it's not just the poles and wires, right?
You can be sure of one thing.
It's transport, it's everything.
You can be sure of one thing. It's not being built by charities. It will be built by government.
But it's not the taxpayer, to be clear.
It will be a mix of taxpayers.
No, but it's everything. And this report...
It will be a mix of taxpayers and private sector.
This same report...
As will our mix.
This same report that you're quoting from also says nuclear power should not be in our plans because it's too expensive and slow.
So they did not run a scenario on nuclear. Okay. They ran, I don't want to be overly technical, they ran a sensitivity, not a scenario.
They were pretty clear, though, that it's too expensive.
And so I can assure you the work that we have done in the nuclear area is far more methodical and comprehensive because that analysis was a sensitivity, not a scenario. They're very different things in the modelling world.
All right, well, let's look at some other figures. This is when nuclear power does come online in the 2040s, once we've got the 7 plants and an unknown number of reactors under your plan. The CSIRO and AEMO, here's what they reckon. Solar is still a lot cheaper. You've got coal still very cheap, that'll be gone. Solar, that includes the transmission lines, the storage that's required with it. In the middle there, pretty cheap. Large-scale nuclear, more expensive. Small modular reactors, off the charts expensive. Why are they wrong?
So if you have a look at the large-scale bar there, for example, they are assuming that nuclear power plants last for about 30 years. In fact, they last for up to 80 years, probably up to 100, right? So that makes a big difference. Secondly, they assume that nuclear power plants run for just over half the time, whereas nuclear power plants are actually always on. I mean,
well, let me show you this. This is another report. This is the International Lazard report. You'd be aware of this. Comes out every year. It too finds solar, wind pretty cheap. Nuclear is the most expensive, and they have a utilisation rate of 97% and an 80-year lifespan for nuclear. Why are they wrong?
Again, with the Lazard report, what it looks at, not dissimilar to CSIRO, by the way, is the wholesale part of electricity. So if you have 1 unit extra of electricity, what does it cost compared to different technologies? Here's how we're looking at it. We're looking at it from the consumer's point of view. So you have to look at wholesale price is important. So are network charges.
So the wholesale price might be really expensive, but you would what?
Well, I don't think they
subsidise
are. I don't think they are. If you even look at what you just showed there, it is comparable to gas, for example. It is comparable to coal, for example.
You're running it 24/7. Gas you can turn on and off.
Well, and it's comparable to coal, for example. And we know that
coal will be gone by then.
No, but you're talking about the report you just showed, right?
Yep.
It is comparable to coal. And we know that in Australia, at the turn of the century, Australia had among the cheapest electricity in the OECD. Now, that was due to coal. Now, as we move forward, as coal retires, exits from the system, it will be replaced with zero emissions nuclear energy.
Would you heavily subsidise that wholesale nuclear pricing?
We're not talking about subsidisation. We are talking about government ownership.
So no subsidies for people's bills.
Again, we'll be very clear about market reform ahead of the next.
Let me ask you about local consultation here. We saw the confusion earlier on. What does happen if locals don't want a nuclear plant?
So one of the big lessons that I've learnt, sort of talking to a lot of people internationally about this, is the importance of trust and transparency. And that is why, from the get-go in opposition, Peter Dutton was very clear, very open. We are looking at zero emissions nuclear energy.
What if locals say no?
And so when it comes to our community engagement process, I was up in Muswellbrook, which is one of the communities which might be hosting a plant, on Friday. And I was talking to a lot of people there. And the conversation we had was around their needs as a community. So one of the benefits we have of nuclear is up to 77% of workers in a coal plant can seamlessly transition to a nuclear plant in the same occupation.
OK, back to the question. What if locals say no?
Well, I don't think that will happen, David, because we've got...
I'm sure you don't, but what if they do?
But let's lay out what we're planning to do, OK?
No, I'm just asking what your approach is if locals say no.
So can I lay out our approach, which includes engaging with locals? So upon coming to government, we will have a 2.5-year community engagement process. Ultimately, the decision, we are part of a Westminster system of government. The decision will be a matter for the minister. Now, if I am the minister at that time, my decision, of course, will be based on the independent coordinating authority's feasibility report. What's in our national interest and what's in the community interest. On the community interest, we need to account for economic, social and environmental issues. They are the very issues for the last 2 years, as I have heard complaints about how the Albanese government has been steamrolling over communities. They are the 3 areas they've come up with.
So if a community says...
social and community.
So if a community says no, you
But
would
when you say
respect that?
community says no, it sounds like you're asking, are we going to have a referendum? No, we're not. That is not best practice internationally.
You were chair of a parliamentary inquiry only a few years back titled Nuclear Energy, Not Without Your Approval. That was the title. You said the will of the people should be honoured. Is that still your view?
Well, that report was under the Morrison government. And if you remember the 2019 election, David, I was part of that. You covered it as well as you always do. We were never publicly talking about introducing nuclear energy.
So that doesn't stand anymore?
We never took it to the people.
All right, so the will of the people is no longer something that must be honoured?
No. In fact, David, I think that's a better question for Labor and the Greens, and I'll tell you why.
You're here right now.
We are now taking this to the Australian people. Okay. We are seeking a mandate. So what I wrote in the report then is consistent with this term of government, albeit this term of government, we're going to all Australians saying this is what we plan to do. The question for Albanese is, if we actually get a mandate, will he respect and will he facilitate the uplifting of the moratorium? Same with the Greens. Are they going to stand in the way and delay action on climate change?
It doesn't sound like you're able to say whether locals will be able to stop these things at the moment. A mandate.
But when you say
Peter Dutton says he's happy for this to be a referendum on nuclear power. Will you accept the outcome of the election? If you don't win the election, will you drop the nuclear idea?
Peter Dutton has made it clear, and I've heard him say it many times. He is more than happy for this election to be a referendum on cheaper, cleaner and consistent electricity.
And he said nuclear energy.
And of course, nuclear is part of a balanced energy mix and very...
That's it?
And very happy to be public about that.
So if you don't win, that's it?
OK, when it comes then to if we don't win, firstly, we plan to win and we are doing nuclear energy as part of our mix, because it's a right thing by this nation. David, it's going to be people like you who will run commentary on that.
I'm just asking whether you would accept the outcome of what you say is a referendum on this nuclear plan.
Well, no, I didn't say it's a referendum on nuclear. No, Peter Dutton's made it very clear.
He said he's very happy for this to be a referendum on energy and nuclear power.
Energy,
and
you're right.
Nuclear power.
Because we want cheaper, cleaner and consistent. And as part of that, is nuclear part of it? But David...
So you're not willing to even say you would accept the outcome
Let's extend your logic. right? Let's extend your logic. As part of our plan, we are going to be saying renewables are important.
Yeah.
So if we were to lose the election, do we dump renewables? I mean, we're going to be saying gas is important. You're saying if we lose the election,
So
we dump gas?
you might still keep going on nuclear even if you lose the election.
David, we are doing this because it's in our national interest. The lights are going to go out, prices are soaring. It's happening today. The operator's out there. So are we doing this because it's easy? No. But we are doing this because it's in the national interest.
Final question.
And that's what we're doing.
For voters, though, weighing this up between now and then, if they... we still don't know the cost, the impact on prices, how many reactors there might be.
We'll come up with our economics in due course.
But would you say if voters don't know, they should vote no?
I know where you're getting that phrase from. And one thing that's very different from the Labor Party and the coalition is even on their renewables target, it's all about the vibe. It always has been. Their single policy instrument at the moment is the 82%.
Your nuclear plan, which has a lot of gaps in it.
Renewables is a capacity investment scheme. Labor to this day cannot tell you how much it's going to cost. We will. We will have more information out there about our plan than Labor. That's always been the case. It is the case today, David.
Well, we look forward to seeing that and look forward to having another chat once.
Appreciate your time. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for joining.
Cheers.
All right, well, coming up, we're going to look at the visit of the Chinese Premier a little earlier this week. Big story. On Monday, he was in Canberra. Lots of agreements that were struck, perhaps a lot of them not dramatically important, but a lot of the goodwill also overshadowed by what happened with Cheng Lei, the Australian journalist who was detained in China. We'll come to all of that. First, we're going to continue this conversation back to our panel, David Crowe, Ashleigh and Melissa Clarke. So just a couple of things to pick up on there, David. When it comes to whether the market should keep investing in renewables right now, which is what the Australian Industry Group and others are looking for clarity on, do you think we got clarity there?
No, I don't think so. I think we've got more of a waiting game for the policy. And so it was a fascinating discussion about the hypotheticals of nuclear, which I think engages some people. But I think for a lot of voters, they really want to know, well, how is it going to work and what's it going to mean to me? And I don't think that's emerging at this point. And so it's a waiting game. On renewables, I do think there's clearly friction between the coalition and between the Nationals and the Liberals on the place for renewables. And I think there is logic there because if you pour massive amounts of taxpayer money into nuclear power plants, by the way, very interesting that it's not just 7 reactors, it's multiple reactors on each site. In America, there are places with 4 reactors on each site. But if you pour the massive amounts of taxpayer money into that, you've got to then deal with the economics of renewable because they will undercut the price of the nuclear energy through the day. And that is something that the Nationals want to address by, say, changing the reliability requirements on renewable projects or changing the subsidies for renewables.
There's 2 really big unknowns that are clear from that interview, saying there might be multi-units on the one site and the fact that it can't say how much of the mix nuclear will make up in the future, not even willing to give a ballpark. Is it 5% or 30%? Makes it incredibly difficult for everyone else in this space to figure out where and how much they should invest, and that's what investors have been saying. But I think the other thing it highlights is if we don't know how much nuclear is going to make up, we know that to some extent they don't want to drive renewables as hard as Labor does, and coal is exiting. That means a massively big role for gas. And the rationale for bringing in nuclear is it's zero emissions. But if we can't even say how much it is, but we are going to have a hell of a lot more gas, then what's the point of bringing in a brand new zero emissions technology?
Technical point, how much will nuclear make up of the mix? But it's really important right now. I mean, listen to what the experts in industry are also saying about why they need an answer on this very quickly.
Many companies are a bit concerned about this because they've been investing on the basis of the existing government's policies. So is the opposition saying in government they would stop all that? In which case that's quite an interesting challenge.
Policy uncertainty drives away investment. It makes the private sector unsure.
And this is what risks pushing our prices up right now.
And it absolutely undermines what governments at a federal and state level are trying to do to attract investment. We are behind on renewables because there has been uncertainty. The Albanese government has attempted to give that certainty, and so are state governments as well. And this undoes that work, and there is that gap, and it goes back to this gap that we're not going to see these nuclear power plants come online, for 15 years at least. So there is that gap. And also it has to be pointed out as well, these coal-fired power stations that at the end of their life, you know, we're keeping a roaring on for a bit longer in New South Wales, and also they're at the end of their life. They will be unreliable because they'll be 50 years old, and that will push up prices as well because
right now
they're
there are
unreliable.
7 coal units offline around the country. This is part of the reason why there's a gas.
Something's got to be built. Something has to be built.
What about
more of it needs to be
And
built?
if there's a prospect of what that should be is changing every 3 years, nothing will get built.
Unfortunately,
that's the point we've come at.
A key claim being made by Peter Dutton is that renewables have pushed up household electricity prices, and one of the people just shown in your clip, Tony Wood from the Grattan Institute, says that's just totally wrong. I mean, we clearly are inheriting the impact of 10, 15 years of total policy disagreement among political leaders about what to do about the energy grid. And as long as that disagreement continues, the uncertainty continues and the impact on prices continues.
What about the local communities? Just to pick up on what Ted O'Brien was saying there, he would, as Minister, factor in, he said, that community consultation process and the views of communities. I mean, they obviously are expecting that the red carpet will be rolled out and everyone will throw open their arms and say, we'd love a reactor, but he will factor in, he said, the community concern. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, that could stop it happening.
It seems if they win the election, then all bets are off.
It's a mandate.
Yeah, that's a mandate and it goes, yeah.
Yeah, all right, sounds like it. Look, politically, just before we move on from all of this, where does this policy help the coalition and where does it hurt the coalition? In terms of the raw politics of winning seats or holding seats, what do you think?
I think there's going to be a lot of focus on the sites of the 7 nominated sites, but I think the strategy from Peter Dutton all along has been outer suburban marginal seats, not the sites where the reactors are. This is a pitch for voters who are hurting at the hip pocket. I think there's still a lot of explanation that's going to have to be made about how something that may or may not happen in 15 years' time is going to help your cost of living crisis today. But this is, as I see it, is a strategy aimed at the outer suburban seats, not the location of the seats themselves.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's the outer suburban seats, but this will be very harmful to the Liberal Party in those inner city seats. Those, you know, they're not getting back the teal seats with this, but also other seats, and also in terms of to get for fundraising for the campaign in the city seats as well, whether they will fundraise enough in those seats. I think this could be harmful as well. But it's just mathematics as well. For the coalition to get close to government, they need some of those city seats in Melbourne and Sydney, and if they don't get close.
Look, let's just quickly talk about a couple of other things. The visit of China's Premier Li Qiang to Australia and to Canberra in particular on Monday. A bunch of agreements were signed. I think it was interesting too that they agreed to have better military-to-military cooperation. They're going to talk about that to prevent some of the dangerous incidents that we've seen. But look, a lot of the goodwill was overshadowed by this moment with Cheng Lei, which I want to show you. Of course, Cheng Lei was detained for 3 years in China. She's now back in Australia, working as a journalist for Sky News. There she is in Parliament House covering this meeting between the two of them, and a couple of Chinese embassy officials, you can see there, trying to block cameras from getting a shot of her, and Australian officials trying to get the guy out of the way. They say to Cheng Lei, why don't you grab another seat? She does, and they do the same thing again. What does this tell us about the relationship, I suppose, and how China thinks it can behave in the Australian Parliament? David?
China and its officials have behaved in similar ways in other countries. I've seen them in international forums be quite assertive. They don't necessarily show what we would expect as respect for the host country. They've done that at the Pacific Islands Forum, for instance, in the past, where they've offended people at those forums. But it does highlight the paranoia about how the media plays out, because they're not, they just don't understand the dynamics of a free media, and it's their constant assertion of their rights over other people's rights.
And was the PM too slow to respond on this? He said he wasn't aware initially.
He couldn't see it at the time. I wasn't in that room, but I've talked to several people who were in the room.
But it was on the news everywhere.
I know, and so I think there was an issue with how quickly he was briefed on it after it happened.
He did eventually raise it with the Chinese
He
Premier,
did raise it with the Chinese, so it was raised, but too slowly.
I just wanted a couple of things. Josh Burns, another attack on an electorate office, this time Labor's Josh Burns, his electorate office in St Kilda. He's Jewish, and the window was smashed, fires were lit, graffiti and red paint through the office. really disturbing stuff, and he was, he called this politically motivated. This did seem a lot more serious than some of the previous ones.
I think it is. Look, Labor MPs have been pretty frustrated by some of the protests and action that's been going on at their electorate offices for quite a while. And for a lot of cases, that's just frustration and discomfort at being disrupted. And that can be very frustrating, but that's also kind of the point of protests. But what we've seen here is very clearly criminal action, but it's also very clearly personal intimidation. And I think that is an escalation from what might otherwise be annoying blockades. That level of personal intimidation towards a Jewish MP is very concerning. A number of experts around terrorism in Australia point to this as an example of something that is beyond the norm of what we have seen in the past.
Meanwhile, I understand Labor Senator Fatima Payman is weighing up right now whether she will cross the floor this coming week on a Greens motion that's likely to come up in the Senate to recognise the state of Palestine. Now, the Labor Party have very, very strict rules on this. You're not meant to cross the floor. You're elected as a Labor MP or Senator. You've got to follow the caucus rule. Last time it happened when they were in government was 1986, and the two MPs who crossed the floor were suspended from the party. Now, if she crosses the floor to vote for this Greens motion, dilemma for Anthony Albanese. Does he kick her out of the party? That would be really problematic, you would think, given community sentiment on this, a young Muslim senator being booted out of the Labor Party over a position on Palestine.
And they don't have the numbers in the Senate to avoid a vote. So there's going to have to be a vote on this motion. I can't see how Labor manages it at the moment, but we've already seen signals from Senator Payman to step back from some committee work in Parliament that seems to be creating distance between herself and the rest of the Labor caucus. So already some signals there.
This could be a real flashpoint on this issue again for Labor this week.
Absolutely, and it'll be a disaster. And also Labor has been very much putting forward, we have diversity, we have young women. So to kick her out of the party, which are party rules, and it would be, under
the expectation from a number of colleagues. Yeah.
But it would be a disaster.
But if you don't, that's a precedent too in the Labor Party. That it's as I say, it's a fundamental rule of the Labor Party. But right now she's still weighing up what to do, but you can understand under a fair bit of pressure too to back this Greens motion from many in the community as well. All right, our panel, Mel Clarke, Ash Raper and David Crowe, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with cartoonist for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, the one and only Cathy Wilcox, and a very warm welcome.
Good morning, Mike. Good to be here.
Peter Dutton has started a whole new front in the climate wars, and it really has electrified both sides of politics. And Mark Knight has got Dutton here as, I think, the containment building. Yeah. There's no doubt about the ability of nuclear power to light the place up.
There's a subterranean meltdown happening under here with all of the people going, what that? He didn't see this coming, including we've got Chris Minns, Chris Bowen, Albo, Jacinta Allen and Adam Bant.
Yeah,
they're irradiating.
This reactor might be built on a bit of a fault line, I think. They wheeled out the stars of the opposition to announce this. Lovely Matt Golding cartoon here.
OK, apart from our lack of costings, real timelines, feasible designs, waste storage sites, and unattainable federal and state legislation changes, does anyone have any questions? That was a heck of a brochure.
It was, yeah. I did love this, David Rowe. Nuclear vaudeville. Yes, we have no costings.
We have no costings today.
Tippity-tappity, crippity-crap. Coming to a site near you.
Yes. Look, how immature he's done these kangaroos and emus with 3 eyes. Quite frankly, I think we're going to have bigger problems than 3-eyed kangaroos and emus after another 15 years of inaction on climate change. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I did love this Glenn Lelevre cartoon. He's got the Geiger counter. He seems to have changed it to a bull detector.
Yes. Tick, 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 tick.
Seems to be putting out a lot of...
Radiation.
Yeah. You think that the costs might be transferred a little way down the line?
Here are your punters looking at the possibilities of renewables and it's a bit expensive, cost of living and all that.
But our kids' future.
Our kids' future. Wow, this is even more expensive. Relax, the kids will pay for it. Yeah. 20 years down the track, they can have the inheritance. What the hell?
It'll all be right by 2050.
Yep.
Ifland has done this
What do you got there?
beautiful GIF. I never saw Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, as fissile material, but there he is. Nuclear makes unclear.
And it's a gift that keeps gifting.
It's the gift that keeps gifting.
We're here for that, aren't we?
We are so here for puns. Cathy, we've all heard of political animals, but this week, of course, it was panda diplomacy, and it was all very civilised as inside Parliament House as the official things got underway. But what was less civilised was Cheng Lei was at this signing of a memorandum of understanding, and she had her view blocked by some Chinese official.
It was a little bit what you might call passively aggressive. It did suggest that they hadn't done their cultural homework.
No, that's right. Bad Yu Chow has got the panda here who's eating the Australian coat of arms. Ties are back on track.
Yes, it's a very lovely drawing. I didn't realise how sort of natural he is with the watercolours and his, you know, that nice sort of eucalyptusy feel.
You've got the panda diplomacy as a distraction here, Cathy.
Yeah, look, some of the writing here is a little bit illegible. Okay, so China surveils, harasses, intimidates Chinese and Hong Kong students in Australia. China angry about Australians speaking out about human rights abuses in Xinjiang.
Panda.
Imprisoned Australian Yang Hengjun, given suspended death sentence by Chinese court for espionage. Australian naval divers injured by sonar pulses from Chinese warships.
More panda.
Chinese fighter jet drops flares near Australian naval helicopter. And here it is, Chinese officials block Cheng Lei at something or other parliament. Oh.
Just so cute and cuddly.
Aren't they? Aren't they? They're adorable.
It's hard to draw an ugly panda. Warren Brown.
But Warren's given it a jolly good go.
Any advice, says the incoming panda. Maintain radio silence until you're contacted by another operative.
China replaces the two pandas at Adelaide Zoo with a new pair.
Cathy, it's been a great pleasure unpicking the events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
It's been fun, Mike. And back to you, David.
Thank you, Cathy. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Mel.
Look, in the nuclear debate, we have heard from the coalition a number of times about how safe nuclear power is, and it is a very well-established energy generation source. But what they haven't talked about when talking about risk is consequence, and if something goes wrong, how catastrophic that can be. So I think any discussion of risk around nuclear has to have consequence as part of the risk matrix. And part of the reason we haven't been able to have a good discussion about that so far is because of the very quick adoption of nuclear-powered submarines under AUKUS by Labor. We didn't really have a public debate about public appetite for the level of risk and consequence when it comes to nuclear material in the country. And I think that is going to hamper Labor's argument against nuclear by not having had that debate when it came to AUKUS.
That's a very good point. Ash.
Something that's fallen off the radar is aged care reforms and where they're up to. July 1 is meant to be new standards, new regulations, but that hinged on legislation going through. We haven't seen the legislation, hasn't been introduced to Parliament. And really, questions need to start being asked of the Aged Care Minister, Annika Wells. Why hasn't she landed this? Where is it up to? Because the sector, and we know there's huge problems. We had the Royal Commission. We need to move forward, and it's just stalled.
All right, David.
The news from the war in Gaza continues to be horrific, but I think there are interesting factors for people to consider about the domestic protests in Australia. Mentioned the attack on the Josh Burns office. We've done some polling that shows that a lot of people don't like what's happening with those protests. 46% of people say that they are less likely to support the cause because of the domestic protests about them. So I think those who are engaged in some of those more aggressive tactics need to really consider whether they're actually harming their own cause.
Very good point. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak just can't win a trick. We're less than a fortnight out from an election where expectations are the Conservatives are heading for an historic defeat. And even the sheep now seem to have turned their backs on the Prime Minister. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Come on. They don't want to play ball.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.